In an article in The Atlantic, retiring Utah Republican Senator Mitt Romney confessed, "A very large portion of my party really doesn't believe in the Constitution." The Atlantic reports one Republican congressman confided to Romney that he wanted to vote for Trump's second impeachment, but chose not to out of fear for his family's safety. In his latest New York Times column titled "Republicans Don't Mind the Constitution, It's Democracy They Don't Like," our next guest, Jamelle Bouie, writes, "If Romney was using the Constitution as a rhetorical stand-in for American democracy, then he's obviously right. Faced with a conflict between partisan loyalty and ideological ambition on one hand and basic principles of self-government and political equality on the other, much of the Republican Party has jettisoned any commitment to America's democratic values in favor of narrow self-interest. But if Romney means the literal Constitution itself, the actual words on the page, then his assessment of his fellow Republicans isn't as straightforward as it seems. Attacks on representation and personal freedom, the hyper-gerrymandering of legislatures to preserve and perpetuate minority rule, and the attempts to limit or restrict the bodily autonomy of women and other Americans have operated within the lines drawn by the Constitution, unimpeded or even facilitated by its rules for structuring our political system. Republicans, in other words, do seem to believe in the Constitution, but only insofar as it can be wielded as a weapon against American democracy." Joining us now is Jamelle Bouie. He is a columnist for the New York Times and co-host of the podcast Unclear and Present Danger. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. So having heard Mitt Romney's confessions that sound like the kinds of things he would never confess to if he was running for re-election, what do you make of what is so far the exit interview of Mitt Romney?
Well, it is frankly remarkable to hear a sitting U.S. senator speak this way about his colleagues and his party. There are plenty, I think, critiques to make of Mitt Romney's career in national politics. I've made them myself. But it is nonetheless striking to see him express such disdain and contempt for so many of his fellow senators, so many of his fellow Republicans, I think correctly identifying a real cowardice those colleagues have displayed with regards to Trump, a willingness, as he describes, to criticize Trump in private, even mock Trump in private, but to not bring that energy to the public, to not speak with their full chest, as you might say, when it comes to addressing Trump in public. And I find that striking and remarkable, kind of irrespective of what I think of Romney.
Yeah, and your distinction to try to get people to focus on the difference between what we call democracy in America and the Constitution. Those are two very different things. The Constitution has some profoundly anti-democratic, which is to say anti-democracy components like the Electoral College and the 2 senators per state, for example.
That's right. I like to remind people that the Constitution isn't the first American Constitution. There was a previous one, and that there was a sense of democratic values prior to the existence of the Constitution. And the fight to ratify the Constitution often involved a real dispute among Americans at the time over the extent to which this new Constitution would restrict those democratic values. And I think it's useful to consider how much of what Americans consider to be American democracy is not so much something that flows out of the Constitution, but is something that is expressed through the Constitution, through its limits and its strictures and its restrictions. And I think we've witnessed over the last couple of years, especially with the attempt to overturn the election, the ways that the Constitution, its rules, can actually be used against what Americans identify as democracy.
Yes, and when Mitt Romney talks about the Constitution, he does seem to be blurring these things.
That's right. Kind of equating the document, the Constitution, and its particular set of institutions it puts forth with American democracy as a whole. So that leads them to say, I don't think Republicans or many people in my party believe in the Constitution, which is fair enough, I think, in that view. I think in my column, what I was trying to do is sort of encourage readers to kind of take those two things apart and kind of understand them a little separately. In part because I think there's a temptation when, say, thinking about political reform to say, well, oh, you want to change this element of the Constitution or the American political system, the constitutional system, whatever you want to call it. Therefore, this must be some sort of push or attack on American democracy. You want to change this thing. But I think it's better to see the Constitution as at its best, a set of tools for expressing a set of democratic values that some which were pre-existing, others which have developed over time and may not be compatible with the Constitution as it exists. I think whether they can articulate it in these terms, a lot of Republicans do understand the Constitution in this way. And so they'll say, oh, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, as a way of sort of expressing this idea that some of the things that democratic ideas that Americans take for granted today aren't compatible with the Constitution.